their theory of the case. This is my opportunity to discuss with you what the evidence presented in this case will demonstrate. That is, there were two different locations used by this couple. There was the marital home, which was on 3 different parcels of land. It was a rather large residence and property. And Tim Smith, Herbert Swilley, and Herbert's adult daughter, who Tim had known and lived with for quite a long time, all lived together at that marital home. And in addition to the marital home, just a few miles away off of Lake Weir was this apartment. And it was not leased by both my client and Tim Smith. It was leased only in Tim Smith's name. And this was a place where these two men who were in an open relationship could take other men that they met on applications like Grindr, like Adam for sex. They didn't want to bring random men to the marital home or have random men around Jordan, the daughter, so they had this apartment. And yes, my client did use the apartment as well. At one point in time, he had a key, his own key to that apartment. But the evidence will show that in the weeks before Tim Smith's body was discovered at that apartment, my client had lost his key. He had no way to access the apartment during the time and date range that the state claims Tim Smith was murdered and his body was moved to that apartment. There was an application called Life 360. People can use it to share their location through their phone with other people that have the application. And Jordan Swilley, Herbert Swilley, and Tim Smith were all using Life 360 and sharing their location with one another for quite a long time. And in the months and weeks leading up to Tim Smith's death, Tim Smith more and more stopped sharing his location with them on that application. He did that because he didn't want them to know how much time he was spending at that apartment. Tim Smith was, by all accounts, loved by everyone who knew him. But like all human beings, he and my client were imperfect. They both wrestled with the disease of alcoholism. And Tim Smith was also a member of Overeaters Anonymous. And through the programs of recovery of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and Overeaters Anonymous, Tim was able to gain the tools to overcome those urges, those addictions. But what came in place of those things? The thing that replaced those things, at least for Tim Smith, according to the evidence that will be presented at this trial, is meeting people for sex at that apartment. It wasn't my client and Tim Smith who were playing out these fantasies at that apartment. It was Tim Smith. And the more and more that he was doing that, he was communicating with men on the internet and by telephone all the way up until the date that the state claims this plot for murder started. March 23rd, 2023. And because of this behavior, and because of what was going on at that apartment and how much time Tim was spending there and how much traffic was in and out of there, other people that lived in that neighborhood where the apartment was located began to notice the amount of vehicle traffic coming to and from that apartment complex. They also noticed at least one young white male with blonde hair who walked that neighborhood in the weeks leading up to Tim's body being discovered. And what happens after Tim Smith's body is discovered at that apartment? This extra vehicle traffic stops, and that young white male with blonde hair is no longer walking around the neighborhood. And yes, law enforcement did thoroughly process the crime scene where Tim Smith's body was discovered at that apartment. And lo and behold, on physical evidence, a bottle of personal lubricant and a sex toy, there were items of fingerprints and DNA that were of value. And they matched in databases to known offenders, to people with criminal histories. James True and Lloyd Kelly. And the state would have you believe that these individuals were thoroughly investigated and ruled out. But I submit to you the evidence and the lack of evidence presented in this case will demonstrate that's not the case. That Detective Pender, who's the lead investigator in this case for the sheriff's office, he's the lead detective. He's a major crimes detective. He's a good detective. But he had made up his mind that it was my client that did this. So much so that he pawned off responsibilities like interviewing Lloyd Kelly, one of the individuals who was in the apartment at one point in time, who admitted to having a sexual encounter with the deceased to his colleagues. Never spoke to them himself. And it's these kind of holes in the investigation that leave reasonable doubt. the detective and the state will rely heavily on a array of electronic evidence. Videos, surveillance from local businesses, surveillance from civilian video cameras, home security devices, Ring, etc. There was vehicle movement on the morning of March 24th, 2023. But no one knows who was driving these vehicles. The state will say, well, common sense. Use your common sense. But when we're presenting the evidence, or the evidence is being presented, whether it's by the state or by the defense, you will notice there is no witness that places my client at the apartment where Tim Smith's body was found, either on the night that the state claims that Tim Smith was poisoned, or early the next morning when the state claims that the vehicle movement was occurring and Tim Smith's body was placed at the apartment after he was killed at the marital home. To fill these voids, the state will present ample evidence of a motive. They'll talk to you about money. They'll present documentation about life insurance policies, about benefits that my client would have received upon Tim Smith's death. But the state doesn't have to prove motive in this case. They can present it, but it's not required to prove this charge. Does it go to premeditation? Sure it does. There was mention of Tim Smith's new job opportunity in Volusia County, and that he was on the verge of one of the final interviews to obtain that position. There will also be evidence presented that maybe he didn't care that much about the job as the state would want you to believe. He didn't even accept the invite for that Zoom interview. His prospective employer had to contact him the night before to remind him. Ladies and gentlemen, upon presentation of all of the evidence in this case,